First of all, thank you everyone for coming to join us today. We've got Nolan Deguid here giving a presentation on pipeline habitat restoration. Nolan is a registered professional forester, and he brings over 15 years of expertise in natural resource management to his current role at Silvacom. His work focuses on leading conservation-based tree planting initiatives, restoring caribou habitat, engaging with Indigenous communities, and advancing wildfire preparedness projects. At Silvacom, he combines hands-on operational expertise with innovative technology to enhance project planning and address emerging challenges in resource management. Take it away, Nolan.
Thanks, Libby. So today we're going to talk about pipeline habitat restoration. As Libby said, I'm a forester, and at Silvacom we view this mostly as a forestry-like problem.
Welcome to the first day.
So from there,
Everybody enjoyed the breakfast.
what we're going to do is I'll just introduce what the what we're going to talk about. What and why? Why are we even talking about restoring some habitat?
Fireside chat with these two gentlemen.
Kind of summarize and scope specifically what the pipeline habitat restoration will be. Move into some of the challenges we've already observed. We've started working with some clientele on trying to figure out how to do these projects already. We're still waiting on some regulatory guidance, but we will be moving into that. And we'll always discuss talking with stakeholders and rights holders when working on the landscape, and just kind of finish it up, and there'll definitely be some time for questions at the end. So first, I'll give you a brief history of Silvacom ourselves. We started as a forestry consulting company doing things like forest management planning in 1983. And one of our main tools is Esri software. So we've been working with Esri software over 30 years. We are a gold partner with Esri. There we go. And we're a group of natural resource practitioners that are also working and applying the newest technologies to solving these problems. And we're not just natural resource people. Our company's, when I first started at Silvacom, I was shocked at how many tech people are actually within our office. And it opens up to blending both our knowledge as resource professionals with people who can actually make the tools and applications that change how we do our work. There we go. Get used to this thing. There you go. So to highlight that, Silvacom is actually a group of companies, and I'll highlight a few of them. One that many people in Alberta probably know is Altalis, a data service provider. This lets us know what data sources are actually out there. We also have MNC and the professional services group at Silvacom. MNC is a title mapping. You might know them and their product DIDS. So they manage DIDS. And that lets us know who's using what on landscape. For people who don't know, that's the dispositions within Alberta. Jambo is a stakeholder engagement software that we use frequently when working on projects. FMS is a forestry management software, which some of the expertise we use indirectly on managing large landscapes, and CS creates applications. So at Silvacom, we like to think of ourselves as results-driven problem solvers. We like problems, we like the newest and hardest problems, and we like actually creating plans that solve them and can be implemented on the landscape. Working in these types of problems require us to be team players. We work with a range of industries and a range of land users. And from there, we have to be able to incorporate that into all of our operational planning requirements. And the end of it is integrity. So when we like to think that if we say something, we have the data and knowledge behind it that people will trust it going forward. For those of you in the room that aren't from Alberta, we are across the country. So our head office is located in Edmonton. We do have an office here in Calgary. We have an office out of Thunder Bay, and we have staff across the country. The change to a hybrid work and remote work model has really allowed us to leverage all those people and really diversify the knowledge base. We also have staff in Dublin, Ireland, as Jambo moves into the European market, and also staff working in South America, tapping into some foresters who have definitely a different skill set than some of us that we do, but utilizing it in our work. Today's presentation, I'll be talking specifically about how the professional services team operates. So I'm a member of the professional service team, and I utilize these people to do lots of caribou habitat work. So lining up with the kind of theme of this entire conference, our remote sensing team. We're bringing, as we get into the discussion here later, you'll see that the new challenge is size and distance and creating what the targets are. So our remote sensing team is valuable. We have both photo interpreters, so the traditional photo interpreters creating vegetation management, but also we're moving into a lot of new technology on how they can create their data sets. Our forest resource analyst team is used on a landscape scale to really manage multiple users and work across it. And then you have me, the energy and environment team, and Libby and a few others. We're boots on the ground. We have been working in the caribou space for 15 years now. And with that, we think we're pretty good at it. So why are we talking about caribou? So caribou were listed as a threatened species in 2003 on the Species at Risk Act. That spurred a lot of discussion. This was continued, or they were reconfirmed, or confirmed again, reassessed and confirmed in 2014 as still a threatened species. And with that, they were put as a priority species under the Pan-Canadian approach to transforming species at risk conservation in Canada. What this did is say, caribou are important both culturally to the people of the north and within caribou ranges. Also, caribou exist pretty much across Canada, especially the woodland boreal caribou herds. They're everywhere. And recovering this specific species has a greater benefit than just specifically to caribou. Oh, this thing is not moving fast enough. There we go. So, what is caribou habitat? So caribou use an avoidance strategy. Caribou's entire goal in life is to not be seen or found by anybody else. So what they do is they go to the hardest places in the forest for anyone to find them. This is generally considered your low productivity, bogs, fens, mature conifer forests. At that point, when they're trying to survive, specifically in their calving stage and rearing phases, the females get even more secluded. They break off from the small herds into even smaller herds, finding even more secluded forest types to stay away from predators. This avoidance strategy works well. These habitat types that I talked about, this mature conifer forest that's mostly bog and fen, doesn't really provide a lot of nutrients or foods for anybody else. This impacts how caribou live. Caribou generally take 2 years to rear young and only have one young at a time. This makes it pretty challenging to recover these types of habitats. There's two kind of main problems with habitat deterioration with caribou. Wildfire being the first one. Caribou have lived with wildfire their whole life, but essentially needing a giant landscape that has some area burnt and some not burnt was important. The young forest stands provide food for what we call alternative prey species. Your moose, your deer, elk move into this caribou habitat. Fires, that's what fires do. They regenerate the forest and bring it back to a young stand. linear disturbance, specifically with human interaction, has created what we like to call highways. They're essentially acting as highways for predators and alternative prey to move into these forest stands, which over time we've seen even predators start to use these linear features in their hunting practices. So linear features created these highways, and the moose and deer, we're starting to see deer move further north in some habitats than have been seen before, and the wolves have essentially followed them up. So after identifying all these problems, we get into the nice legislation. So it started federally. SARA, Species at Risk Act, being identified as threatened. There we go. Once they're identified as threatened, federal government created the Federal Recovery Strategy. And with that, it said, we need to do this, we need to prioritize them, and identified what some of the challenges and problems are with maintaining caribou habitat. From there, the province signed on to a Section 11 agreement under SARA, which said that this is a joint problem. It's both federal and Alberta and provincial. Many provinces signed a Section 11 agreement, and it says that we will work together to recover these caribou habitat, and we will work together to make these populations self-sustaining over time. Alberta's response was range plans. We identified where these caribou are living, identified what their specific herd ranges are, and decided what are the challenges specific to that range. So that became part of the Woodland Caribou Recovery Plan, which has been in draft stage for a long time, but is essentially being implemented. And what we're kind of get into deeper here today is the new sub-regional plan requirements that will be coming. So in Alberta, sub-regional plans are developed for land areas of concern that have a greater concern. And 2 have been approved so far, one in Cold Lake area and one in Bishow Lake, have both been approved. And within these sub-regional plans, there is a requirement to start taking action on operating disposition types. And pipelines have been specifically targeted as one of the first ones that we'll be starting to do some activities on. So currently, the sub-regional plan has been approved. We are currently waiting on the regulations, which will be driving how we do this work. But from the sub-regional plan, we can take that new pipelines will be required to be revegetated. Existing pipelines will have their disposition amended to have this requirement as well put on it. And essentially what we're saying is whatever is off the line beside it is going to be required on the line if it's considered biophysical habitat for caribou, if it has some requirement of caribou life. Caribou use a massive landscape, and they use a lot of sites, not necessarily all of them, but and they do avoid specifically young stands, but they will travel through them as well. So upland sites will come back to a plant community, generally defined as an ecosite or an ecosite type that is consistent offline, both upland and wetland. There might be some fluctuation in the age and time of what level of plant community we're gonna have to get to. And what it does is it assigns a time frame. So this is gonna be a 20-year kind of commitment. The first 5 years is planning. And we'll get into how we're gonna plan some of these activities. But there's quite a few challenges that are gonna need to be addressed. So we have 5 years to submit a plan that the government will think will be acceptable. From there, we have 10 years to actually start implementing that plan. We have to have 50% of the lines actually worked on and started recovering. That gives us time to kind of work out some of our potential challenges and figure out how we're going to do it. And then we have 5 years to complete. So why specifically is Silvacom talking about this? Like I said earlier, we've been doing linear restoration For over 15 years now, we've been involved in the research of actually starting to do this type of work. What we've seen is that these challenges on this specific pipeline project are going to require some more strategies than just what some environmental professionals provide. We think incorporating our remote sensing team will create a lot of value in starting to do this and make regulatory compliant plans. So if you're not from Alberta, I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by linear feature. So lines in the forest. Most of us think of those as power lines, roads, pipelines, as we'll talk. But one of the big ones that really kicked off this whole initiative was seismic cut lines. So seismic was exploring for oil and gas. You can see in the picture here these faint north-south lines and east-west lines. They run across the entire province. There's roughly 250,000 kilometers of seismic line within Alberta alone, which creates a massive problem when we start to calculate habitat fragmentation and degradation. So we started there, but the intent was always to have pipelines and potentially roads and transmission lines included down the road. But the seismic lines were the easiest ones to start with. No one owns a seismic line after it's been done. They are frequently used by other industries, and there's even a requirement land use wise to incorporate them when you're doing land use projects. But since no one owns them, they're easy to actually get in and work. So linear restoration as a program actually started voluntarily a lot of time with oil and gas in the early 2000s. When caribou were identified as threatened, and the understanding that habitat degradation and fragmentation was one of the key drivers in this, companies lined up to start implementing these plans. We've seen some of these projects on the landscape as we continue on. They went out and started trying to figure out how do we recover these seismic lines. This was completed voluntarily as an idea of replacing what's being disturbed and fragmented on the landscape. 2017 brought around the provincial government instituting the Caribou Habitat Recovery Program, which actually is providing fairly steady funding to these initiatives. There's millions of dollars every year going into implementation programs, mostly across the province, but a lot of it's been focused in the Little Smoky Allopech region, Cold Lake, and up in the Fort Mac region a little bit too. That's been working for the last 8 years now, and now these sub-regional plans becoming approved are bringing a regulatory requirement to this whole initiative and actually putting it on the operating landscape. So we'll scope it a bit. Just a quick calculation. I'm a forester, I like talking hectares. I know pipeline people like talking in kilometers, but it's roughly 90,000 hectares of pipeline within caribou range in Alberta. That's a lot of pipe that's going to have to be dealt with. Our economy, this is essential infrastructure to our economy in Alberta, and we want to continue to prove that we can do this type of work pretty productively in Alberta, advance our environmental innovation, and continue these types of industries while reducing the impact on the landscape. So that's kind of the spiel on why. We'll break into kind of what some of the challenges we know from the work we've done previously. So we take kind of a three-prong approach when we're doing these types of work. We start at the site. Why isn't something growing there already? Pipelines, although disturbed, were not so disturbed that nothing shouldn't grow there. We bring this over from our linear restoration as well. The goal was that a lot of these sites would recover naturally over time. These are, oh God. There we go. These are kind of the main drivers we find in preventing habitat restoration and revegetation on any of these lines. So shade. Seismic lines are a very tight area. They range from 5 to 10 meters. Pipelines are going to range a little bit wider. But that shade, you can be seen, there's higher snow accumulations, lower soil temperatures, generally higher moisture on a seismic line. A lot of that can be attributed to some shade problems, compaction. Any constructed site may have a compaction issue, as well as continued use post-construction. Pipelines, seismic lines are used to access the bush by a range of land users. And even a quad is going to potentially, over time, start creating a compaction issue, which limits how things are going to recover. Soil moisture. Any line that's been cut, especially through some of our more peaty soils, generally has a higher soil moisture on the line. That compaction generally brings that peat land down closer to the water table, preventing revegetation from having the chance to establish that rooting community. And can also impact things like flooding and things like that. Human intervention. This one's probably a little bit bigger. We used to think of this as a recreational problem. People using the line to get up and down. Pipelines have been maintained basically since they were built to keep them unvegetated. A lot of the desire was to prevent interference with the pipe by any vegetation growing around there, and that's what's been done. There's been from what we've seen on the landscape, there's been lots of actions to kind of mitigate pipeline disturbance, keep some vegetation, keep some corridors and wildlife kind of benefit on a pipeline, but for the most part, we're maintaining them through mulching and spray programs. And then competition. Over time, those mulching and spray programs allow for grasses and other vegetation to outcompete our forest type. We generally are looking at, in caribou habitat, a lot of black spruce. Black spruce is a slow-growing species in cold climate. It doesn't want to compete with grass well. It lives forever, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to grow big and tall and strong. But it might be there if we're looking hard enough. One of the things that we pride ourselves on is working with what is there. Just because we see these problems doesn't mean it's everywhere. Our remote sensing team and our field team work really hard to figure out what vegetation is growing. Because if we have spots that vegetation is already growing, let's keep it. There's a lot of environmental benefit to what's naturally coming. We're going to keep that understory vegetation growing fantastically, and we'll move forward. Is there enough to satisfy a habitat restoration requirement? We can only assume that when the regulations are approved, there's going to be some actions that are required, densities of trees, things like that. So do we have enough trees, and where are they? Yeah. And then defining our target. It's great to figure out all the problems, but what are we actually trying to get to in the end? So here, we like to use our remote sensing team, specifically, as well as our field staff as well. But we join them together to use some of the new technologies that are being discussed throughout this entire conference with AI. Our remote sensing team is working with machine learning, specifically computer vision imagery analysis, which is kind of a machine learning and neural network joining to essentially look at a picture and tell us what it sees from high-level imagery. This is changing how we do a lot of our vegetation inventories, and we're applying it to this target group. It also allows us to view what's on the line specifically and start trying to adjust any challenges that may arise from the pipe having altered the kind of ecosite type potential going forward. It also changes how we do our field work. Using a data-driven approach like we use has driven our desire of our fieldwork to look more at verifying what we think we're seeing through our data capture. So it's a targeted approach. It's very similar to a vegetation inventory completed for things like Alberta Vegetation Inventory or other provincial vegetation inventories, where we assign it and go out and look and say, were we right or were we wrong? And then can we diagnose what we're seeing or what our model is picking up that decides if is it right or wrong. It also allows us to do some supplementary data gathering. Some of the things are much harder to identify, specifically temporally during a growing season, on deciding what the challenges are to that specific site. So it's really it limits It reduces our number of field people necessarily being out there, but it gives them a much targeted approach on being in the field and figuring out what they want to find. So, being that we like to think we're pretty good with data, we work on what do our clients have. We want to know. There's a lot of data in this province. A lot of companies acquire their own data and keep it in-house. And we have the ability to work with all of it. Some of the data sources we prefer though, LiDAR is fantastic for identifying heights of trees specifically. Do we have fairly mature vegetation already on this landscape? Do we have none? We use it for identifying also the actual condition of the pipe and the ability for us to move and transform on it, and it informs an operational plan on physically being on the pipe. The high resolution imagery we use into our imagery analysis, that's, we're talking real fine, real high resolution. We're looking generally under 30 centimeters is good enough resolution for us to really identify what kind of vegetation we're getting. And with our remote sensing team and some of our FRA team, we're starting to move into hyperspectral imagery as well. We're trying to figure out not just if a tree is growing there or a plant is growing there, but what tree, what plant. Will it be an acceptable species when it comes time for a regulatory approval? So for those who don't know hyperspectral imagery, we're talking about your near infrared and your infrared bands that we can actually judge condition of the tree or the plant. Is it stressed? Is it growing well? That type of information. What happened there? We're missing a slide apparently. Anyway, we're missing a slide here, but we'll talk about it. Data capture. We're talking about all these fancy sources of data, but how do we catch our data? Drones are the newest and greatest thing out there, and we are a drone company. We employ drones when needed. But the fact that we've been doing this data capture for such a long time means that we like to weigh the economics of how we capture information and knowing where it comes from. So we use drones when required, project specific wise. We can use satellite imagery. The world of satellite imagery is ever expanding, and the monitoring of the world is getting more and more frequent. But we can use traditional methods like aerial photography from helicopter or plane to really get high resolution images that we feed into our types of models. And using our specific approaches and knowledge within our company, really train our models to work better with that type of imagery. So now we're into the operational challenges. We figured out why this site and that site and this site and that site aren't growing a tree. How do we put that all together? We're now talking about a challenge of, in traditional reclamation, we were talking about a couple hectares in one specific location that might be branching over a couple different ecosite phases. This is potentially hundreds of kilometers of reclamation happening in one project. How do we put this all together? That's where our geospatial team really comes in. We can start breaking down a project into different operating areas, segments. We've generally in our linear restoration, we break things down into 100-meter segments so that everything is working. We can break it all the way down to that ecosite type though, if needed. Coordinating all of that and finding out what the vegetation relationship between all these different sites is the challenge. When we get operational, delivering trees and getting things planted on the landscape provides a whole new challenge on how we do it. And having a massive landscape requires that we incorporate all the logistical actions required to do this. Secondly, and this is a big one, this got moved. I don't know why that got moved. Secondly, all the other people on the land. That's a huge challenge. It's potentially one of the biggest challenges. If you've ever been in Alberta, just because there's one clearing, that doesn't mean there's one pipe within it. Multi-pipe dispositions, adjoining dispositions, all these create challenges, and all of them will have rules at how they have to work together. Incorporating how these clients want to have actions completed on their disposition, which is their right, with how the adjoining person wants to work together. Do they want to work together? How do we work with forestry, recreational land users on the landscape? Is challenging, and that's where the big part comes in. But it provides opportunity as well. There's a multiplier effect here. When we partner up and work together on these types of groups, these projects, there's benefits gained by working together. And the final part is, what is our actual work area? If you know anything about land use and DIDs and dispositions in Alberta, they're not always what were drawn by the surveyor at the beginning of the project. Construction changes, as-built may or may not be complete, as-built plans may or may not be completed. Pipes might not be where we think they are. Temporary workspaces were created and left. That's still a footprint on the landscape. Who's required to reclaim it? These temporary workspaces and other things are now back to being property of the Crown. They were completed under a temporary disposition that allowed that work to be completed for the construction of that pipeline, but no longer are required. Is that going to be incorporated into this type of project? Because it's still a footprint that's causing an impact on the landscape. From a high level, from the federal government perspective, generally, we can generally say the footprint disappears if it's under roughly 4 meters. They have some rules about, can you view it from a specific photo at scale? But generally, 3.5 to 4 meters, that footprint becomes considered not footprint. So what is going to be the actual disposition required? And that's shockingly a big challenge. So we'll move into a couple of the stakeholders here. First one, this is brand new. We don't even have the regulations yet. They originally were out for discussion during the spring and summer of this year, with the government saying that they felt like they were going to be out before December. It's generally why we said we were going to come up here and talk about this, is we figured we'd have some new regulations to actually discuss with people. They're still waiting to come out. But we know that even when they do come out, from what they say to when they're actually implemented, our experience with the linear restoration footwork said it continues to change. And we do believe that they will use what's happened in linear footprint on the seismic line stuff. There's been a lot of research and knowledge gained on how these actions will work, but we will move forward from there. But I will say, with the land use team that works with Caribou from the provincial government, they're very responsive and they're very interested in the final goal of actually creating caribou habitat and not necessarily having a regulatory framework that's overly strenuous and difficult to achieve. They're more focused on the actual goal of caribou habitat recovery and have generally been fairly responsive to new ideas and changes on how we do things. Being a company that works in both the planning and implementation, we've had the opportunity to provide lots of feedback on how these operations actually work, and they continue to be responsive to that. This one's gonna be the big one. So we have started working on some of this with some clients. Internal operations, pipelines have been managed very similarly for a long time. There's internal protocols and decisions that companies are already using. We're gonna definitely have to impact some of that. There's gonna have to be a risk assessment and a comfort level with what type of work we're gonna be doing and how we do it. And it's gonna go both ways. We can adjust and change how we do things to achieve these final goals. But the reality is, if a pipeline operator, specifically their operations team, are not comfortable with what's happening, it will continue to be a challenge with the regulator. There will be, from what we've seen in the regulations and the draft regulations, there are carve-outs for facilities on pipelines, for emergency response areas, especially on very remote pipelines. But they're still tight. I was out online actually measuring what we're going to do on a pipeline and trying to show that to a client and say, this is what potentially would it be accessible in a giant pipe. And there's going to be a comfort level that's going to have to be discovered at this point still. They're not quite very comfortable yet with kind of what's proposed, but it is going to be the requirement. But we think we can get that, but it's going to take time. That 5-year window is going to be important. I think companies are going to have to determine how they think they can achieve this and how they can work it into their kind of comfort and risk. I mean, there's other regulators out there. It's not just Alberta Environment. There's AER, there's CER. They're going to have requirements as well on how that pipeline is maintained. And incorporating all of that into these pipelines will be a challenge for sure. Okay, it seems like things are bumping around here, so weirdly. It doesn't even like that slide, it just disappears. Last one is rights holders. So Indigenous communities. This is a great opportunity. We work with a lot of Indigenous partners on these projects in linear restoration already. They're local, this is their home territories. They work on these landscapes, they live on these landscapes. They have a great interest in actually doing some reclamation style work. Being local also has a lot of benefits on bringing jobs into specific communities and areas, some of which are a little bit struggling right now to find some work. There's an opportunity for traditional knowledge to be incorporated as well. These were taken out, we've taken out plant communities. There's a great opportunity here to start in a revegetation phase, encouraging some of those plant communities to come back to provide medicinal properties and other traditional uses within the landscape, as well as the actual impact of bringing back caribou. Caribou habitat is generally large and fairly general, which means it's recovering caribou habitat is recovering most forested habitat in their range, which is going to have benefits on many other species out there. It will and is designed to restrict and reduce moose and wolf movement, which does have some potential challenges. Moose is a vital food source for a lot of communities, and encouraging moose populations has been preferential for some of the communities we've dealt with, but the greater understanding of bringing these vegetation types and sites back to a specific, what it was before we were there, is generally going over quite well. It also provides the opportunity to build capacity within communities. The desire is not just for a consultant to walk in, make a plan and leave, but to actually have the community have some buy-in and support of these types of projects and encourage some movement of environmental training and technology into the community that can work on this. We're talking about 20-year timeframes on some of these projects, which means there can actually be a commitment to a generation of learning environmental knowledge and bringing it to a commercial enterprise, essentially. So, the slides are bouncing around. I'll wrap it up. There's a big challenge. The incorporation of an operating facility on an oil and gas specific terms is the challenge. We're pretty good now. We're getting dialed in at recovering just a linear footprint on the landscape. But now we need to still be go in there. We need to be able to continue to function of that operation. We need to maintain response capabilities. And all of that needs to be incorporated into this plan, while also trying to achieve as much of this regeneration of caribou biophysical habitat as possible. We think, specifically, that trying to enhance the current operations is the way to go. It'll take the least amount of change from that specific company to incorporate these activities into their plan. and working with them to do that, and even identify with them how their pipeline works. So I'll use an example of one of the projects we're already working on. Their initial response was, we're going to keep the vegetation control area over top of the pipe. We just don't know where in the pipe it's going to be, but it's going to be over the pipe. And I got out there and flew their line and walked their line and said, do you know that every 5 years when you come in here, you build a road on the side of your disposition to get in here? You already have your access defined here. So is that what you want to maintain? Would that be easier? They already have trees growing on their pipe that they didn't believe they had growing on their pipe, because certain remote areas are just uneconomical to get to. So showing them the full range of their pipe and their operations generally might lead to changing that comfort level. So that is my kind of time. I'm definitely open for questions here. And I will move to this one as well. If there's any information, we have lots of pamphlets and brochures kind of on linear restoration specifically. You'll want to look at the Silvacom one for the information on habitat reclamation, kind of how we've been working on that in the past year and continuing on in the future. That's it. Thank you.
I know the regulations have come out. Has there been any internal discussion on how they're going to roll that out with the multiple other regulatory agencies it's going to impact? Like you said, the AER, the CER, Alberta Environment.
I believe they were stakeholders at the creation of the sub-regional plans. They were definitely involved along with companies, but we haven't heard exactly how they want to incorporate them yet. And I think especially like, we already have some concerns, and that might be what's delaying them, is that some of the regulatory requirements from like CER and AER, how are they going to change, and who's going to change there? I think there will be a struggle on that. And like I said, we're still waiting to hear. That might be what the part of the delay is. Like I said, we were expecting to hear about this a lot earlier, and it's delayed work so far. So, thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for the presentation. Can you speak a little more about the difference between range plans and sub-regional plans and how they relate to the different caribou herds?
Sure. So the range plans were built specifically to caribou herds and addressing both what the challenges of that specific herd in that specific range need to be addressed. So they're a little bit more targeted towards a specific herd or in a specific range, and the specific actions or threats to them in that range. So we can see, as an example, the Little Smoky herd, which is out, the Little Smoky and Alopesh herd Alopesh comes out of Jasper, Little Smoky stays north of Hinton area. They have a large recreational and oil and gas footprint pressure. There's a lot of people in that landscape. So part of it is keeping people out, not just predators and alternative prey, but how do we keep people out to minimize how that habitat fragmentation continues? Whereas maybe a more northern herd, currently working on the Yates caribou herd, which is on the border of the Northwest Territories, they do not have that industry or recreational pressure. Their challenge there is more of a natural disturbance where the fire regime in that area has definitely hit its kind of maturing point and has burned significant area, in that specific range. So addressing the challenges post-fire, and maybe can we bring habitat back differently, or what the seismic or linear features effect has been post-fire. well, I guess the sub-regional plans. So sub-regional plans are targeted, I keep hitting that thing. Sub-regional plans are targeted to important areas in Alberta and not necessarily, although caribou is the driver for some of these sub-regional plans because they are identified as important species in that area, sub-regional plans are trying to take in a much broader scope of land use within that whole area. Hopefully that makes enough sense.
So around pipelines, there's typically vegetation management, which is like spraying, cutting, and managing it so that trees don't grow up and damage the pipeline, right? So the restoration part, is there planting being done, or is it just naturalized species from around that are allowed to grow to a certain
We're hoping it's both. We're hoping it's both. So promotion of naturalization is definitely our goal. But knowing construction techniques of pipelines over time, there's going to be some limiting factors that will need to be addressed. And potentially the fastest way to do that will be some type of soil manipulation followed by a planting process, probably. There's a lot of new techniques out there, some of the drone seeding and drone planting techniques, things like that. But there will probably have to be some planting involved in it. I don't know if we can fully encourage natural revegetation on all of this in the time frame that they're going to want. One of the things we're waiting to hear about, and even in the linear restoration realm, it's a challenge currently, is we've gone out and we've planted trees. When do we say that that footprint is actually back to a natural state? Currently, linear restoration has been kind of developed out of a forestry background. They use a lot of the forestry type auditing processes. So they are using an establishment survey at year 8 to 10. As I told you, that program started in 2017, which means we were on year 8. So the establishment surveys are just getting underway to figure out, are they taking off? Is this working? And from there, the government will then have to decide, when is this considered reclaimed or restored and part of the natural footprint versus being considered still a human footprint on the landscape. But yeah, so that's hopefully, it's probably going to be both though on a planting and naturalization. As our theory is, especially in caribou range, because it is so low productivity, we're talking really old, slow-growing fens and bogs. Protection of natural species, the natural ingress, is the most important factor, because those trees may be small, but they're old already. They're 10, 15 years old. So to try and catch up with planting, we're setting it too far back to knock them down and start again.
Good morning.
Hi.
I have a couple questions. You talked about indigenous communities, you work with them. Do you ever come across the, like let's say, building capacity with the communities in the areas of indigenous environmental monitors?
So we aren't currently working with monitors. Some of the nations that we've partnered with are, to put it politely, they're taking our job. Our goal is to train them to take our environmental job. So they're not necessarily following the monitor training specifically, but what we're trying to do is encourage kind of the traditional knowledge blending with our Western science to say, this is what I see when I'm out here and what I think is preventing this from coming back. And they are saying they're saying, this is what we see. Can we blend that together so that when it comes time to do the actual planning process, especially in ranges that are really important to that specific community, they can be the one actually driving the plan. And from there, once they've built the plan and seen kind of our techniques on what we're doing to reclaim, these projects will be driven, indigenously business driven. So they're also doing the actual implementation work generally as well. They're on the landscape, digging the holes, planting the trees, running the contractors who are out there as well. That's the goal, is to really drive it to a position where, yeah, I don't have a job on those. I'm more there to help supplement and support an Indigenous community doing the work rather than providing a plan. What we've seen at the start was we'd show up with a plan and say we're going to do this, and some people are very excited about it. I've had trappers tell me this is the best program ever because it's kicking people out of their trap lines and reducing people on the landscape. And I've had other trappers that absolutely hate it. And generally, what we find is really pushing on the engagement has been important, and really being in the community. It's allowed us to extend our time frames with the government when doing the planning process, because we really need to get people telling us how they use the landscape. I don't need to know how you use the landscape. I need to know where. That's all I need to know. That's why we keep telling people, just tell me where you go. Don't tell me what you're doing when you get there.
Okay, the other part is the drone operations. Have you ever considered an Aboriginal or an Indigenous company to do your drone applications on site?
So we, as Silvacom, we are a drone company. We do have our own drone, and we're a drone training company. And what we've actually been doing is training when we're working with communities, we're partnering to do the training with them to get them to an advanced RPAS certificate, which they can then invest in their own drone for doing the planning. But if we try to keep these projects as indigenously run as possible, we're more there supporting. And so if that community specifically has drone operators already within their, or they have relations with drone companies, we're more than willing to participate in however they want.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to talk further because I was on a couple committees or boards with Alberta for the caribou, Parks Canada, and the Little Smoky.
Oh yeah.
So very interesting.
Yeah.
I was also a monitor on that, in that area.
Oh yeah. Nice.
Yeah, so that's why I'm asking questions, but I will come talk to you in a bit.
I'm also in the exhibitor booth here. We got a thing set up there too, so stop on by.
You had mentioned something in your speech about pipeline owners maybe being reluctant to, see their pipeline covered in trees. So I was just wondering what your impediments to success are. Are they, bureaucratic in that nature? Or are they ecological?
They're going to be bureaucratic. Some of the initial results on some of our field work is that trees really like, especially in really cold climates, trees like growing right on top of the pipe. It's generally the warmest soil. That pipe is a little bit warmer than everything else. It's been disturbed a little bit more frequently. And so actually being on the roach of a pipe that hasn't had a lot of vegetation maintenance had probably the tallest growth coming. So ecologically, I'm not really concerned about that. It's going to be bureaucratically that we all hear about roots interfering with foundations of houses and all types of things. That's a challenge that's going to have to be dealt with and understood before companies are going to be accepting of kind of a change of procedure. And that's going to be both internally with the company, but also potentially from some of the regulators like AER and CER, who do have requirements on that type of stuff. I think we're all good. Like I said, I'm at the exhibitor booth if you got any other questions, comments, concerns. Right on.